everybody. The goal of me posting this video is just to clarify something which we discussed today in class. So you remember we tried to do this in class today. We tried to create a program that allows a teacher to input the number of students and later on to input their marks. Then the program calculates the class average and counts how many students scored below average. So you remember how we did it? We created a program. We told the user enter the number of students. We saved the number of students here, and then we declare an array of that size to be able to store the mark of each student. Okay, then we initialized sum to 0, and then we tell the user enter the marks for student, let's say student 1. You see, enter the mark for student 1. Later on I will change, you're going to enter the marks for student 2, and so on and so on. And so every time the user enters the marks, we are saving those marks on our array, okay, on our array at a particular position. Okay, so just by declaring this array, it means on our RAM now we have our array that could be maybe this much big, okay, that will have all those positions up to the last position, which will have an index equal to size minus 1. Okay, so we have our max array, you see. And then every time the user enters the marks, we save those marks at a certain position on our array. You get my point? Then we also update the sum. Okay, so by the time the loop terminates, we're going to have the total. Okay, we're going to have the sum. So in order to calculate the average, we just divide by the number of students, and then we're going to have the class average. You see, then in order to count how many got below the average, so again we were using a loop to move from the first position to the last position in our array. Okay, and then every time we get inside the loop, we are checking, is the max at this position below the average? If so, we want to count that mark. Okay, and then once the loop terminates, we're just going to display the output. Here we are going to display the average which we had calculated before, and we are going to display how many students were below average, which is this variable here. You see, so this is what we were doing. But did you notice when we changed it to use a modular approach, when we began to use functions? Because that is the point which I want to clarify. When we began to use functions, we created two functions. Okay, one of the functions was called calculate average. It was receiving the max array and the number of students. Okay, and then inside this function, we were prompting for the mark of each student. We are saving it on our array, and then we are updating the sum, and so on and so on and so on. And then by the time the loop terminates, we are calculating the average as this sum divided by the number of what? Divided by the number of students. And then we are returning what? The average. This is what this function, the calculate average function, was doing, you see. But also we had another function which is called count below average, you see. Now this function also, it was receiving the marks. Okay, it was receiving the array of marks, it was receiving the number of students, and it was receiving what? The average, you see. So we were looping from the first position on our array up to the last position, which is the size of the array minus 1. Okay, since the size of the array is equal to the number of students, so the last position will be the number of students minus 1. You get my point? Because our array has the size equal to the number of students, because you created an array which can accommodate the max of all the students. You get my point? Yeah. Now, so we are moving from the first position up to the last position, you see, and then we are checking if this score that is here is below the average, if this score is below this average, you want to count that. And then later on you are returning what? You are returning count. You see, this is what this function was doing. But I want to show you something here. Did you notice when we came to call these functions inside our main function? You see, here in the main function we said enter the number of students. Okay, then he will enter the number of students. We're going to save that. Okay, then we created an array that will have the ability to store the marks of all the students. So if he enters 10 students, our array here will have a size of 10. If he enters 15, our array here will have a size of what? You see, our array here will have a size of what? 15. You get my point? But did you notice that this array is currently empty? Because we have just declared it. Okay, we have just declared it, but inside there are no values. At position 0, there is nothing. At the next position, there is nothing. At another position, there is nothing. At another position, even on the last position, there is nothing. It is just an empty array. You get my point? Now, did you notice that we are passing this array? You see, do you see this array here? We are passing it inside this calculate average function. We are passing it while it is empty. You see, this is the concept I want you to see. You see, so what concept am I showing you here? I am showing you a concept called call by reference. Okay, in other words, this is what I want you to know. Arrays are always passed by reference. Okay, when we are passing this array, you see this variable here, max, this is our array. It is this one here. Do you get my point? So if you pass here max, you are passing an array to this function. You see this function here, calculate average, is receiving the array, and it is also receiving the number of what? Of students. You get my point? But the first parameter is the array, and the second parameter, according to our function, okay? According to our function, the first parameter is the array. It is supposed to receive the array as the first parameter, okay? And the second parameter is the number of students. You get my point? Now, here we are passing our array, which is actually empty. Do you notice that? It has nothing. There are no marks inside this array. There are no marks, okay? And we are also passing the number of what? We are also passing the number of students. You see? To which function? To this function here, calculate average. You see? So, what I want you to notice here is that arrays are always passed by reference because they can be huge, okay? So, you are not trying to duplicate that array. You are not trying to take a copy of this whole thing. You are not trying to duplicate all this memory somewhere else. No. You are not trying to copy this and then you pass all that huge copy to some other function. No. You are actually giving that function access to this entire memory. That is what you are doing. Always you have to know that. Whenever you pass an array to a function, you are not passing a copy of that array. You are actually passing the actual array. You are actually passing the original array. You are passing this whole original memory. You have given it. It's like you are passing it up to that function. In other words, that function is having direct access to this space. That is what I mean. That function is having direct access to this space. Do you notice that? Let me repeat for the final time. That function, calculate average, is having direct access to this memory space. It is having direct access to this array. So in other words, here in this function, when this function tells the user enter marks for student 1, when the user enters the marks and we save it here, you are not saving it. You are not just saving it here. You are actually saving it on this array. You get my point? What you are seeing as if you are saving there, you are actually saving here. So you are actually saving on this array. What is happening to that variable there is actually happening to this variable here. You get my point? That is what we mean. That is what we mean. Okay? So in other words, what you are trying to do on array M of this function, you are actually doing it on array max that is inside the main function. So you are not actually just saving to the array M. you are actually saving to the array max. That's it. That's the concept. Okay. So when you call this function, you are passing an empty array, but by the time this function completes, this array will no longer be empty. It will have the max which the user was entering. You get my point? And so at this particular moment, when you come to call this function and you pass again max, at this particular moment you are no longer passing a max array which is empty. No. You are passing a max array which has already been populated with the max of students that we have filled due to calling this function. You get my point? Very, very important. Very, very important. You have to know that, guys. By the time this function completes and returns to you the average, at the same time, this array has already been filled with the values. So it is no longer empty. It is no more empty as before. That is very, very important to understand. Why? Because of call by reference. And always remember, whenever you pass an array to a function, you are passing the reference to the entire array to that particular function. So whatever you are doing on that parameter there, you're actually doing it on the original array variable here. Whatever you're doing on that parameter there, you're actually doing on this original array here. Always remember that. Always remember that. That is the magic happening behind the scenes. And the reason is very simple. Arrays can be big. You can have an array of 100 values. You can have an array of 200 values. So it will be time consuming and it will be memory inefficient to copy the entire array. So you can't use call by value. It will be very, very bad. That's why you always use call by reference. Always. So here you are writing it like this, but internally the compiler is converting this one. It is converting this one into this. It is converting it into something like this. That is what you should know. Internally the compiler is converting that into this. Whenever it sees an array here, whenever it sees this, it converts this into a reference value. That's what you should know. That's what you should know. Thank you for listening. All the best.